Yes. Okay. I think that. All right. We're streaming. Hey guys, welcome to the Political Pundits podcast on the Progressive Powerhouse YouTube channel. I'm Jaggu.
I'm Bells.
And we have here Yusuf and James. Y'all want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Hello. Here, you go
Ahead,
first.
James.
Oh, God.
Oh, okay.
All right, one of you.
I'll go. I'm Yusuf. I'm 17. I go by he, him pronouns. I am a leftist on political TikTok. I am +Yusuf H. Follow me. I make pretty crappy content. But I am of North African descent. And, follow me, TBH.
TBH.
And James.
Sweet. Hi, I'm James. I'm 22. I'm from Indiana. I'm also a political person on TikTok, which is really fun. My handle's @JamesGetsPolitical if you want to follow. If not, that's cool too. I pretty much just vibe and do stuff on that. So, yeah, I guess that's the background for me.
Cool, so we can get started. I think today we're just gonna talk about like the ins and outs of the Biden administration, our hopes, our fears.
He's destroying the commodity form, all that.
Right.
Comrade Biden. That is the title of this podcast.
And a misleading one at that.
Yeah. He's made a ton of Mao quotes. You know that? Very like analogous. Didn't he say like he's a woman held up half the sky?
Oh my God, no, I think he did. Yeah.
Yusuf Biden. Brother Yusuf Biden.
I don't know, man.
Slavic communist.
I don't know. I've been seeing a lot of OAN coverage. You might be a socialist if they're right. I don't know. It's pretty crazy. Like,
it's one of those things where like people would like try and during the election cycle at least like, oh, he's a socialist. And it's one of those things for me where I had to like be talking to people and be like, no, you don't get it. Like I wish. Like I hope. But
oh my God.
Unfortunately, that's like not the case.
No, I have a very conservative father, and at one point we were talking politics as we were wanting to do, and he mentioned Nancy Pelosi being a Marxist, and I busted out laughing, and I was like, dude, if only, like that would be wicked.
That is the worst thing to do when talking with parents, like laugh at the takes they have, because sometimes it is just like comedy and you're just like holding it in because if you laugh like they're about to get so pissed off, but I'm like, no way you just said that.
No, like I usually I'm really good at controlling myself, but that one instance I was like the thought of Nancy Pelosi being like a Marxist is just acutely funny to me.
Like whole 9 yards. Like I wish. Oh my God, the things I would do. But yeah, no, nothing Marxist about Biden at all. I know that you. But
we should make that disclaimer.
Yeah, no, immediate disclaimer. Nothing comrade about him. But I guess we can't deny that there has been some good executive orders. I know, James, you just put out a video on the pipeline. If you want to expand on that and your thoughts on that situation.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, he's been pretty good as far as really short-term reversals of Trump-era policies, specifically pipelines that are getting built from Canada to the U.S., basically. And it's been a bit of an ongoing issue, particularly as an indigenous rights issue, like things like Dakota Access and Keystone, for a lot of reasons. So, like, indigenous tribes, first of all, like a lot of the pipelines, specifically Keystone, and to a larger extent also like DAPL and Line 3 are really, really bad. Potentially, words are difficult. They're problematic for a couple of elements, specifically with indigenous rights. That's really more what I focus on. I think everybody can agree on the environmental impacts of a fucking oil pipeline. But the indigenous rights are really what I've been focusing more on, and that's kind of what my video was trying to be a bit more geared towards. I know that there are issues with potentially water contamination of indigenous water sources. There's sovereignty issues with pipelines initially going through tribal areas. There are treaty violations, arguably. I know a few tribes have been arguing that there have been violations of treaties and that they have to have their input on the development of pipelines and things near their land and sovereign territory. And also there's a larger issue with the development of what are called man camps. So in indigenous circles, it's essentially a colloquial term for when you're building pipelines and when you're maintaining pipelines, you'll have large camps of people, predominantly white contractors and like construction laborers. And in indigenous circles, and Canada's done a really interesting comprehensive study on this, have shown that those man camps, if you look at them on a map, the increases in abductions and sexual assaults and human trafficking can be correlated to the existence of those camps. So indigenous women are disproportionately affected by pipelines in ways that are really interesting, and not interesting in a good way, of course, but like interesting in that you probably wouldn't have thought of, at least I didn't initially think of that being an issue. So there's been kind of that flashpoint, more or less. And that's what I've been trying to cover a bit more. And the Biden administration, to their credit, did a really good job of at least shutting down one of them. Although, like, you have the Keystone XL, which is now kaput, but you still have Line 3 and the Dakota Access Pipeline that are still in limbo. I mean, Dakota Access, Line 3 is more so going through, I think, but Dakota Access is a bit more in limbo. So that's one good thing he's done, I guess.
And do you have any like trust or confidence that with the Dakota Pipeline or Line 3, there will be any reversals on Biden's part, or do you not hold that trust?
I'm extremely pessimistic of any of the Biden administration, particularly because of his own rhetoric, but also because I understand that like there's a calculus to be made, at least with donors and with how much political capital he's willing to spend on environmental issues. What I've seen historically is that environmental issues are really easy to talk about rhetorically, but like when you actually get down to the meat, like to the nitty gritty of it, like politicians are usually unwilling to do things that they might see as stifling economic growth in the short term.
Right.
Which, even though I would argue that that's maybe not entirely the case, especially with Dakota Access and less so Line 3, I'm not optimistic. I think Dakota Access, there's a fair to good chance just because there's been so much media coverage. And that's kind of pushing them to do something. But like the amount of people that I know that are talking about this issue that know about or like comprehensively understand the Line 3 pipeline as well is lower. And the media attention's been a lot more scarce for that one. So I doubt that'll have anything happen to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that also kind of brings up like a huge point about the Biden administration is a lot of the work we're going to be seeing done by them is going to be based on media pressures and things, just because it is a neoliberal administration, and that tends to be the functions of it, which I find interesting and I find somewhat beneficial. Just that there is that sort of pressure and push on it on occasions.
So like
sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, you first.
Okay, so like the argument that people make about the pipeline, like how it's leading to like a loss of jobs and whatnot, how much does it actually hold up, do you think?
So we know that actually I did a bit of research on this. So we know with Keystone that the long-term jobs that it might have had were like maximum 52, like actual permanent jobs, and a good amount of those would have been Canadian anyway. So like when you look at actual impact of American jobs for permanent long-term jobs, maybe 30. When you look at short-term jobs, like seasonal position type is really how we would measure it. You're looking at a few thousand possibly. Although there's discrepancies to that, of course. Like some of those people are going to be able to find other jobs. I know if you're like certified in certain aspects of pipeline building and maintenance, you can also just go to other pipelines. You can do other things. You can go to other projects. If you're construction, you can be retasked to do other infrastructure repair work. It's not like it's a static loss of like 10,000 jobs or whatever the hell. The only number we've gotten in anything that I've seen regarding like a few thousand jobs came straight from the company that was contracting out the pipeline. So I don't know how reliable they are on that, but I would assume maybe you're looking at a short-term loss of more so around like 5,000-6,000 jobs. Although if we really cared about that, which I do personally, there are other ways of kind of getting jobs to people who need it in those areas. A lot of infrastructure jobs, like public works programs, things that we've actually already seen in the Green New Deal, for example, are really, really good substitutes for pipelines.
All right, thank you. Fellas, do you have any more questions on that?
Yeah, we can just segue that honestly into the discussion about the Green New Deal. and what hopes we have environmentally for the Biden administration, and what we can see in the future from them. James, if you want to maybe go into that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, as far as the Green New Deal is concerned, I don't think we're going to be seeing widespread support of the Green New Deal in whole, which is sad because personally, for me at least, I think the Green New Deal is really the bare minimum expectation that we should be upholding by our government. But that's just me being a radical. But my fear is that we're probably going to get into a position where we're going to be looking at cutting emissions and investment into renewables, but we're not going to be looking at any like really long-term comprehensive infrastructure packages of the type that we would need. And I definitely see I have a very well-founded fear, in my opinion, that Biden might, after rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, just consider that to be the victory, and then ignore the rest of it, because that was a really easy political move for him. That's just the neoliberal order kind of working with itself. So I don't know. I think as far as the Green New Deal is concerned, we're maybe going to get bits and pieces of it, because I think bits and pieces of it actually make a lot of sense. Renewable reinvestment, maybe the retrofitting of some buildings in major cities. But other than that, I don't know.
And I think that's too what you said about. Yeah, go ahead, Yusuf.
Oh no, saying that I feel like if anything, the normal liberal in the sense of the term are very passionate about climate change in general. And I feel like if anything that there may be meaningful change, whether or not it's the Green New Deal, I think that climate change is a really easy thing to sell as a politician. So I feel like out of the things that we're talking about, that's one of the things I'm more optimistic about. Having something in legislation. I don't think it'll be the Green New Deal, but like James said, bits and pieces for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, just that whole idea of the Paris climate change, that's something that I've been, since the beginning of the administration, kind of making sure people understand as they see all of these objectively good things that Biden is doing, to watch out, because this first month could be the cap. This could be it. This could be the bones that were thrown for the first month to get everyone off his back, and then it's like the liberals like to say, back to brunch, and we're over it again. So I think that's just something interesting that we definitely need to look out for, specifically with this administration, and understanding how I hate to say neoliberal again, but understanding how neoliberal administrations tend to function.
Yeah, I hope that Congress, at least, given the more progressives that have been introduced into there, you see already Bernie and AOC already criticizing Biden as of right now for his stimulus check, for example, which we can talk about later. But I hope that at least that allows them to push for more climate change issues and more push towards that, rather than just being keen on the administration doing what they want. I think that we have to be a bit more optimistic in that sense, but we'll see.
Yeah, we can hope.
Yeah, I agree.
Do nothing but hope, and talk.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of that too can come directly from us, right? Doing congressional trips, for example, can be a big part of advocacy and leftist mutual aid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly what we talked about last episode.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Access and mutual aid is going to be a huge aspect, especially when we have, at least now in comparative to the last 4 years, an administration that's just that centimeter closer to our side.
I mean, you saw what MJ did with his last live and the whole war on Yemen, and how Biden was able to pull out finally afterwards. I mean, this type of stuff can work. Climate politicians, getting them to recognize the issue, and then hopefully spark more change.
Yeah.
What's next? So Biden, as part of climate change efforts, created a national climate task force, and he basically had almost all his members in his cabinet basically into this task force to solve a lot of these problems. So I wonder if I still have it open. There you go. The National Climate Task Force. So this is a part of his executive order. There is hereby established National Climate Task Force. The membership is Secretary of the Treasury, and it basically goes down to a lot of different positions within his cabinet. I'm not going to go ahead and list all of them out, but the mission and work that they state is a task force to facilitate the organization and deployment of a government-wide approach to combat the climate crisis. This task force should facilitate planning and implementation of key federal actions to reduce climate pollution, increase resilience to the impacts of climate change, promote, protect public health, conserve our lands, waters, oceans, biodiversity, deliver environmental justice, and spur well-paying union jobs and economic growth. As necessary and appropriate, members of this task force engage on these matters with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, workers, and communities, and leaders across the various sectors of our economy. So obviously you have to talk about whether or not historically this task force has done a good job in actually like solving a lot of these key issues that we talk about. For example, you have the coronavirus task force and the Trump administration led by Pence and whatnot. And from that, like how that kind of like went off, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, was that very much like a good thing? Because there's a lot of efforts on their side to like not tackle it as serious as we can.
And especially, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Especially too, considering, I know for me, like I spent today before coming on, just really doing a comprehensive look of the cabinet in itself, in its full self, and the people within it, and you have to wonder as well, with all of these huge corporately linked names, can we trust them within a climate a climate discussion when we have, I mean, even
it's better than having the CEO of ExxonMobil as the Secretary of Defense.
Is it so?
I thought it was Secretary of I thought he was Secretary of State, right?
Oh, Secretary of State,
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Wasn't it Secretary of State? Yeah.
I mean, the Secretary of Defense now sits on the board of Raytheon, which is one of the biggest military steel productive businesses in America.
They're headquartered like right over here. It's kind of funny.
So I mean, we aren't looking at huge progressives in the cabinet. We're looking at board members of steel industry and heads of I don't think they would have gone.
I don't think they would have gone confirmed if they were true progressives.
True.
But Senate. But I think it's interesting when it's a lot of that like return to Obama time, because a lot of liberals and a lot of people will see this and be like, you know what, there isn't the ExxonMobil CEO that has a position. It's a lot of that like backdoor stuff that we're used to in politics.
Right.
And it's not in people's face anymore. And generally when issues aren't, right in front of them, people won't go past that surface level and, truly how, messed up things are. And so that's dangerous in the sense that it's people get compliant. They say, okay, it's not in our face anymore. Why fight it? We have a president who thinks climate change is a good thing. That's better than what we had. So we're making steps. And I think, as leftists, we need to do our best, especially with a platform and, the occasional video that gets on the For You page to keep up, the pressure of we're not, good things have happened, but we're nowhere where we need to be.
No, exactly. And I think like when you discuss like media and stuff like that, like, and I hate to use this talking point because it's very often used by conservatives, but we're not stupid. We know that the media is very liberal, and to some extent that's good. To others, it's tough when you have a liberal administration, a liberal media. And for example, when I'm looking into the cabinet today, of course, I'm not going to find many critiques of these cabinet choices because these are liberal medias for a liberal president, and it's tough to get any sort of critiques from anyone. Whereas during the Trump era, you get it every single day. Every news notification is a new anti-Trump talking point, which worked great because we had a lot to work with and we didn't have to look for it. It was always there, and that will not be the case for the Biden administration, unfortunately.
It's that surface level type, issue. Like it's literally on the surface with Trump.
Yeah.
But the issue's still there with Biden. I think we have to. It's uncomfortable for a lot of liberals. The issues are still there and are still prevalent, but I think that, we got to keep doing our best to just keep pushing that information out. I hope the algorithm doesn't change on us. I've heard like Chandler talking about that, like how a lot of his videos aren't in as well as they used to be, but we'll see.
I would not be surprised.
Yeah, the platform is definitely a good thing. I think it's something that we can definitely keep pushing upon. I'm not so sure how far TikTok will go, but maybe one of us, maybe Bells will become the next Chad as Biker or something, But yeah, hopefully someday we'll definitely get there. So you were talking about Raytheon, like how they're like a, what was it, weapons company?
Yeah, so it's a steel production. Steel production usually producing.
I know, because when I was interning there, they had a flyer, or I was about to intern there, and they had a flyer where it was like literally had like fucking fighter jets on there. I'm like, okay, yeah, there's something militaristic about it.
Right. So what was interesting is Lloyd Austin, he's the Secretary of Defense in the cabinet, and he has sat on the board for Raytheon for, I think, a good couple of years now. I can't tell you the exact amount, but a good couple of years now he's been sitting on that board. So I think it's important when we're looking at these cabinet picks to think, okay, where might these people's intentions lie? Because for someone who sits on a board and is going to make money quite literally directly from the prospect of war, and doing that while simultaneously being the person making huge decisions as to whether or not we are going to be entering wars, it puts a bad perspective on it, because you have to.
Like, it's the motive is there for someone to do something wrong with an administration. I think that kind of segues about Raytheon being like a weapons company into the whole Biden and like the whole Middle East and stuff like that. How is he escalating, or is he de-escalating conflict there? Is all of that situation being handled thoroughly? Are they still dropping bombs on innocent children in like the middle countries in the Middle East? Yusuf, you said you kind of looked into that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that was a good and phenomenal segue, and a lot of it has to do with what's happened in the past 4 to 8 years. Mr. Blinken, the new Secretary of State, was the Deputy Secretary of State under Obama, right? And pretty much got his foreign policy start with Clinton, and has pretty much been with Biden since Biden was a senator.
And we'll add, again, what we do know about him is he very often will be quicker to work with neoconservatives than he ever has to work with a progressive agenda in any way, shape, or form. Continue.
Yeah. So I think just having just some context of that, and most of Biden's foreign policy team is from the Obama era. Right. But it's different because Trump has done a lot in the Middle East. I don't know if that was Kushner or him himself, but he's done quite a lot. Personally, I think he's done a lot of damage. You've seen a more friendly approach to a lot of the authoritarian figures in the Middle East, specifically with Egypt, the dictator Sisi. Obviously Saudi Arabia, and pretty much making some of the Gulf states, the UAE, a factor, not just Middle East politics, but Africa and other parts of the world. We talked about MJ, and then his work with the whole stopping the Yemeni, not stopping, but pressuring Biden into stopping offensive regimes in Yemen. And that's amazing. That truly made me happy, because obviously what's been happening in Yemen for as long as I can remember is truly one of the worst humanitarian crises like in world and like in our history. But what scares me is that you've seen this friendly approach to dictators or authoritarian regimes in the Middle East in an effort to pit them against Iran. And now you have all of the Middle East, including Israel, against Iran. And I don't know how Biden will truly react to the whole Iran thing, and then working with Saudi Arabia. truly, because Saudi Arabia, as you guys know, is probably one of the worst countries when it comes to human rights issues. So I truly have no idea what will happen. I think that you have so many factors when it comes to the Middle East, and it's not as simplistic as oil anymore. Have the military issue with every country having an arms deal that the U.S. is benefiting on, and like you guys said, that connects to whatever the company that
Raytheon, yeah.
Raytheon.
Raytheon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So huge
Jaggu.
So like you were talking about, Saudi Arabia and whatnot, right? What do you think the relationship is like? Because, obviously after Khashoggi, it's like kind of not good, right? We would expect that to be so, right?
Yeah,
the sentiment's still there.
Yeah. I mean, the crown prince there is extremely imperialistic in the sense of.
I think it's that's an
imperialism. Yeah. I think that's what I'm saying. I just don't know how they react to Trump being buddies with them. Trump, before it was Saudi Arabia is a political alliance only, right? It was they have this, in a great strategic standpoint. And then over the past 4 years, it was no, we're actually friends with them now,
right?
And that's why it was a strong message for Biden to say like, okay, we're not doing offensive regimes in Yemen anymore because that's what Saudi Arabia wanted. So I feel like the best thing is obviously the U.S. not being having a huge intervention in the Middle East, but when you have authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, I don't want to say Egypt because I still want to be able to go there, but like Egypt, it's really the lesser of two evils. I mean, do you want this U.S. intervention, or do you want this authoritarian regime that's gonna, that's killing our people?
Yeah. Or can we guarantee
there's the other option?
Better.
Sorry, you cut out. That was my Wi-Fi. Mark, can you repeat that one more time? I'm sorry.
No, sorry. I was just saying, with that lesser of two evils, can we even make any assumption that any decision Biden would make militarily would be beneficial in and of itself at all?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we had a recent show of history with Libya, with the intervention there, and then how destabilized they are now. You have Syria, and that's also brings up my next point. If the U.S. decides not to do anything and, there is no sort of another Arab Spring, China and Russia will become involved. I mean, you've seen Russia become involved in Syria and have tried to expand their influence on the Middle East. What truly is the best option? I don't know if I'm speaking because I know I lived in America. Is American imperialism better than Russian or Chinese? And it's a hard choice, and that's kind of the damage that I was talking about with what Trump has done, making it, being friendly with these authoritarian leaders straight up. Trump literally called Sisi his favorite dictator, unironically. So, where do you go from there? Do you continue the same Obama tactic of, oh, they're doing horrible human rights stuff over there, like we don't like them, they're doing wrong things, but we're still giving them $2 billion in arm deals every year? That's always the thing with Middle East, is that these problems are so fresh and so new that it's hard to find any tangible solution. And what do we fight for here in America?
Yeah, it's kind of a fortunate situation for us all, because it's like, for many of the liberal media at least, right, the floor for Biden is all the way down there, especially for the Middle East conflict. The way Trump has exasperated it a lot, the way he's ruined a lot of like good, I guess, allies, and how he also formed some terrible ones, right? But like what you talked about, like a lot of the associated with regimes and whatnot. It's like if Biden makes, and he based a political statement of this press conference, like that's it, you know, our perception of it changes, our acceptance of it increases, and like I feel like, you know, us leftists like to talk about how, you know, SOCDEM kind of creates compliances and complacencies and whatnot, right? How we can't exist in capitalism for so long because of our complacency, right? It kind of goes into that as well. We're like, Biden, we're going to be complacent eventually, and that's kind of a problematic thing. So we have to be able to understand what his legitimate critiques, or what our legitimate critiques are of Biden, right? To understand what are the issues that he himself is exacerbating through his like executive orders and whatnot. So thank you so much for this, Yusuf. This was good.
Yeah, amazing points brought up by you.
No problem. And I'm totally, don't think that like you guys, since you guys aren't, you know, Middle Eastern or North African, you guys can't talk about it, because like it's one of those situations where I genuinely have no idea what the F to do. Like, where do you go from? Like, what do you support? Do you support, you know, the hope that, you know, there is another sort of Arab Spring? The Arab Spring took almost 30, 40 years of authoritarian regime for that to come on its own, right? Like, do you really subjugate people towards that in the fear of America doing another Iraq, doing another Libya, or doing another Syria? And even to an extent, doing another Egypt, where they supported a democratically elected leader, and then a year later, the military intervened and have a dictator now. So it's one of those issues that it's like there is no good choice. I hate using the whole lesser of two evil, three evils type thing, but I truly do not see any option moving forward.
This is kind of a conversation that me, Aggie, Josh, and Dami are having about like revolution versus reform. And it's become so easy to have this like defeatist attitude because you simply don't know what to do for your hometown. You don't know how to solve your issues.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, you either die or starve to death, you know? It's so difficult to choose what to do. But like the best that we can hope for is for some level of reform, because a lot of these whole revolutions, like you're talking about, like the the Arab Spring, like a lot of that will end up just having people dying. You know, kids having to hold the fight and grab rifles and go out and like die from IEDs and stuff like that. So,
it does get extremely depressing. I think you saw that with the discussion where, you know, two of them literally had to take time off social media after it to, you know, get their, you know, senses back. But I think that's kind of the feeling that like most of us have towards it is when issues aren't, you know, just surface level and they are layered, where do you attack it from and how do you attack it, you know? So I think it's definitely interesting, and I hope more dialogue about it will, you know, create solutions. But it's hard when, you know, most of us are personally connected to the places where the struggle is happening.
You were talking about this too. There needs to be more nuance in talking about all these subjects, understanding the complete geopolitics, rather than just blaming stuff on America and then bullying it down to some sort of like anti-capitalist rhetoric, right? Like you were talking about, America isn't like the only like imperialist power in play, and there's a lot more conflict there, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you've seen that just with Russia and Syria. I mean, you talk about U.S. bombs killing, you know, the occasional hospital. Russia has no sort of, you know, oversight as the U.S. did. I mean, Trump kind of classified that in his second year of office, but you know, the stories that come out of, you know, Russian interference, their bombings, literally just them shooting down apartment buildings. It's scary, and you know, a lot of, you know, I've planning on making a video about this, just calling out, you know, leftists that Russia and China especially specifically Russia within the Middle East and China and Africa, have done so many effed up things. And that their influence can't be forgotten about, and it needs to be talked about. I think that there has to be nuance about these issues because people truly don't know. And like Bells was saying, if you look up anything about the Middle East, you're getting all of these liberal, news articles. I personally had to go to read articles in Arabic to find out more information about like Blinken and his stuff because it just isn't readily available even for leftists. So I think that it'll be interesting to see the dialogue and discourse about this.
Yeah, and I loved one point that you made there, Yusuf. I mean, I loved all the points you made, but one point specifically, just that conversation about not boiling down all of these issues that we're going to see within the Biden administration and maybe even possible positives. You can't just boil everything down to this classic anti-capitalist leftist rhetoric, because the things that we're going to be in the next 4 years have direct impacts and effects on not only the working class here in our country, but in people in other countries and civilians in other countries, and how they're going to be put in certain positions. And I think that that's huge that we don't, because I find myself falling into it often, just kind of taking everything that I hear politically and boiling it down to being like, well, that's capitalism, sorry, and using that same talking point, to be wary of nuanced on these issues and understanding it, especially like I said, in an administration where you don't have the same in-your-face critiques all the time, where you have to be looking for.
And specifically when it comes to this whole anti-capitalist leftist thinking, when it comes to the Middle East compared to Western states like the U.S. and Britain and France, is still extremely religious. And it's rooted in that same Western religious indoctrination that anything leftist is against the religion, right? So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking to, people of, Islam that are religious, because, the current ruling from the scholars that are government backed, but the current ruling from the scholars is that communism is against the religion. So, I mean, I'm sure you have like similar things within, India and, Pakistan, where it's a lot of that indoctrination you have to get through. And we can't, sometimes, we do have to,
I think the failure.
I don't want to bring up this conversation right now, but we do have to aestheticize our ideology 100%. A little bit more.
Hello Kitty says hello to communism, bro. Like, I'm 100%.
Yes, TBH. So, that's something we have to keep in mind.
Do you think that like Gaddafi's failure is kind of put like a negative perspective on like socialism for people in the Middle East?
I'm personally, I'd like to refrain from talking about Gaddafi in a podcast setting.
I got you.
I have some views on Gaddafi, and I think that, that's a very valid point, but a lot of Middle Easterns and North Africans don't see Gaddafi as socialist or any sort of leftist, revolutionary. Gaddafi is a tough top because he did kill and hurt a lot of Libyans, and he's, I compare him to Saddam. You have to realize that they may have done some good things when it comes to anti-U.S. imperialism, but they did some messed up crap, a lot of messed up crap. And so that's just personally my view on it. And maybe in the future I could, go public with a lot of those thoughts, but just for now, I just wouldn't like to talk about that.
No, I got you. Thank you so much, Yusuf. This was good, bro.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. I'm passionate about it. So
yeah, I know. I was like,
issue.
I wanted Yusuf to be on this podcast, bro. He knows so much about all like the Middle Eastern, and then that would like connect to like a lot of like leftist concepts as a whole.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think that Shata would be a perfect person to bring on, specifically with them being Palestinian.
She left me undelivered. Oh my god.
That would be a perfect person to bring on. Specifically, they are a lot more knowledgeable within leftist ideologies than I am.
Yeah.
Are a lot more better articulate than I am, and they are Palestinian, and they're going through their own liberation effort right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an extremely important topic to bring because, as leftists, I feel like we should be focused on a liberation movement going on in our current society. I think that even goes to Puerto Rico. We should be talking about that. You got Bella's over there doing her little thing, but when we have these liberation movements going on, I feel like a lot of political TikTok gets caught up in stupid semantics, and sometimes like we do need to realign our thinking of what are we actually trying to do.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's, for me personally, that's why I've always said that, like, if you're a leftist whose ideology and whose end goals aren't fundamentally rooted in anti-imperialism and decolonization, associated with the liberation of indigenous peoples, then I don't trust you.
Right.
Speak your truth.
I don't trust that, especially other white leftists who don't really frame things, particularly from a standpoint of indigenous liberation and anti-imperialism. To me, it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, so you want to replace the current world order with another white world order? It doesn't, to use like a more kind of me-centric term, like it doesn't vibe well with me. I'm not, it definitely doesn't have good energy when I'm listening to it, especially when you talk about like a Palestinian liberation. We talking about Kurdish liberation, which is a really interesting talking point, in my personal opinion. Close friends of mine are of both Palestinian and Kurdish background. And I've kind of obtained a really, really good background, specifically in Palestinian liberation, but to some degree in Kurdish liberation through my human rights minor being focused on genocide studies. Yeah, I mean, we talk about the Middle East, and I think a lot of times, especially amongst like Western white leftists, there becomes this inherent need to both establish purity tests as well as neglect the fact that like you're combating imperialism as a whole. Like you touched upon, like it's not just us, it's the Russians. It's I think to a large extent the Chinese as well. I'm gonna get crucified for that, but yeah, I like I'm very anti-Chinese government personally. God, I hope TikTok doesn't hear that. But it's
I can hear Adrian just coming from like
oh God, the socialist type house is gonna crucify me for this one. No, I think it's one of those things where I look at a lot of, especially Middle Eastern issues. I think the Biden administration has this really unfortunate position of where they see the optimum as being the operations of the Obama administration, but a little bit more dovish. And that scares the absolute hell out of me, because the Obama administration's policies specifically towards Palestine and the Kurdish liberation were outdated for their time. In reapplying, especially Palestinian policy that you saw under the Obama administration to today's era, like the game's different than it was. If one would even go so far as to call it a game, but like, the field is much different. The state of the Palestinian state and the Palestinian liberation struggle has shifted so much in 4 years, especially thanks to Trump's particular brand of pedassery when it comes to fighting indigenous liberation.
Within the last year specifically, with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, maybe not Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Bahrain, all creating these ties with Israel. So it's definitely a completely different game, and that's why it's like this conversation will be so much different if we did it a year later today. We're going to have a lot more to go off of, but a lot of it is just speculation on are they going to continue. It's hard to even compare. It's hard to compare it to are they going to do what Obama did, just because like you, James, it's so different. It's so different.
Well, I mean, and the fundamental problem too is the calculus has shifted, right? At least under the Obama administration, you had at least the feigned pressure from Gulf state nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they, some people would argue, I'm not directly saying this as if it is my own personally deeply held opinion, that Gulf state nations like the UAE and Saudi Arabia sold out the Palestinian people for arms trades and flight routes, and that,
yeah,
that's
100%.
Totally. That's an opinion I actually personally hold very deeply. It's that you have a lot of countries now that are willing to trade Palestinian liberation and use it as a kind of talking point to get a better deal with Israel, and that is troublesome. Compound that with like mismanagement and misleadership in the Palestinian Authority, as well as like just the general state of things. Israel being a settler colonial state. It's not a good outlook. Kurdish liberation as well is being stifled, especially under the Trump administration. He basically sold them out to Turkish envoys. That's an unbearably difficult position, in my opinion. And, I think moving into the Biden administration, like, my expectations are low, but I'm hoping they can at least try to stabilize the situation for at least the Kurds. The people deserve better.
I know that there's been talk within Iraq, right? My brother-in-law is from Iraq, and there is talk of splitting Iraq into 3 ethno-states. So the Kurdish state in the north, part Sunni and part Shia. And it's a small area for how many Kurds there are spread over so many countries. But at least there's some sort of reform, as we were talking about. I hate to bring up that word.
No, I know. When it comes to
discussion about that earlier.
Oh my God, no. When it comes to indigenous liberation, the word reform leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. Because I've seen what reforms look like in the United States with the American indigenous groups or Canadian indigenous groups or Kashmiri indigenous groups, right? Yeah. Or the Irish, right? Reform doesn't usually mean problem solved. It usually just means problem exacerbated and put under the table for a while.
Right.
And that's unfortunate.
But I think this is getting kind of semantical, but like people like to conflate what reform and revolution actually is.
Yeah, that's
political upheaval of like a very massive scale. You could technically consider a revolution, right? Secession would also be considered a revolution as well, which I think a lot of these groups will end up doing, right? You're talking about the whole Iraq division theory, that would just be a secession, right? I'm a Dravidian nationalist. What we want would be like a secession of a lot of South Indian states to go like kind of secede from the rest of India. So stuff like that, I think you have to ask yourself whether they're a form of revolution solely because they're done through the means of like political parties or whatever, right? I don't know. Maybe that's just a semantical thing, but.
No, I don't disagree, and I think there's something beautiful. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, like, moving back to the. Okay, cool. I was going to say, moving back to the point that Bell's made, is that we do tend to focus a lot on like anti-capitalist rhetoric, but there are some really hopeful elements that I've been seeing in a couple of liberations movement. Palestinians have a thriving leftist communist movement. Or at least they have in the past decades. It's died down a bit, but it's still there and moving. The Irish Republican Army has always been socialist by nature, or at least socialist leaning.
Yeah. Did I say that right? I think I botched it, but
you're chilling. But and then you've got, even the current Kurdish Revolutionary Project is inherently anti-imperialist, at least, and I think by nature of that anti-imperialism to a degree anti-capitalist. So there is a hope in liberation struggles. It's just a matter of will the Biden administration facilitate that past utilizing them as either tools for counterterrorism operations or to put pressure on the Iraqi government to not be as corrupt as they have been.
Yeah, a lot of leftists like to infantilize revolution and
absolutely
and kind of fetishize over it. When in reality, that's what a lot of these anti-imperialist movements are doing. They're the ones that are what we would consider most radical right now.
Yep.
Maybe it's in your best effort to support them rather than stating ideological bounds and not deciding to support them because of that, right?
Oh yeah. No, I
think that has to do a lot with sorry. I think this has to do a lot with what James is talking about with the white leftist, Western leftist type thinking, where it is all about that semantic type ideology BS to BH that you see.
I completely agree. I mean, I have a lot of like white colleagues that administer purity tests to people like the Kurds, who they'll say things like, well, Kurdish liberation is important, but like to that degree, if they're working with the United States, how much of a liberation anti-imperial struggle is it? And I'm like, well, like that's an easy purity test to pass upon someone when you're not getting put in mass graves, right? Like one might say that using the largest imperial power to your anti-imperial means is remarkably clever.
Yeah. I mean, they used Israel support too, and that's why you see a lot of Arab hate towards them too. But
I've been seeing a lot of
you have
sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying, when you have an indigenous liberation, I think that by any means necessary sometimes is justifiable.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of like leftists.
Obviously, you do.
I've seen a lot of leftists with like anarchists who like who talk against like a lot of anti-imperialist groups, because a lot of them. I'm not an ML. I'm going to say this before I say this, but like a lot of them kind of center around like Marxist-Leninist ideology, or just even the conservative vanguard as a whole, right? Establishing political parties as a means to help incite revolution and whatnot. I mean, I know Bella's your ML, right? But like I have critiques of ideology, but like at the same time, like we have to understand like a lot of these groups, they'll associate with ideologies based around their specific material conditions, are basically what's readily available, right? Marxist-Leninism, as a concept, is one that's very readily accessible to read, and one that has a lot of like anti-imperialist efforts that's already been taking place, right? So that's why a lot of people revolve around that. A lot of indigenous groups tend to be very anarchist focused, right? Like the Zapatistas and whatnot. So like a lot of that, you can't hyperfixate on ideology. You have to understand that people want liberation, and your best efforts to support it.
Well, and I think to another degree as well, it's really problematic to try to ascribe fundamentally Western ideologies to people of different cultures and different material conditions. Like as Americans, there's always that. I see a lot of like white colleagues of mine saying things like, "Oh, like indigenous groups in the United States were basically communists," and it's like, well, no, like that's not. One, it's just wrong, but it's also just a very. It's also just like a very problematic statement to try to say like, well, what works for us in maybe parts of Western Europe is going to be applicable to the Kurds or to Palestinians, because you have to have a blend of the material. Like the material conditions are going to bring forth whatever kind of revolution or whatever kind of reforms they want, and we should be supporting whatever they're doing, as long we should be supporting their liberation struggle. Period, in my opinion.
For sure. And I think that as we round up to 10 p.m., that's a good place that we can call it at, if you guys are all right.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
You both have been absolutely amazing. I'm so glad I got to hear both of your perspectives. And hopefully we can have you guys on again, and we can do this again sometime, because I had a lot of fun with you.
Oh, absolutely.
Anytime. Thank you.
So much fun, guys. All right.
Thank you so much.
Stop the stream. Y'all say bye real quick.